Anian everyone. Today I'm going to be sharing with you 5 Indigenous authored books that I find myself recommending the most. I find myself recommending these books to Indigenous readers, to non-Indigenous readers. I think it's just a very well-rounded collection, and they all happen to be personal favorites of mine, which obviously has something to do with why I chose them, but I think each of them carries a really strong message. And you might notice that a common thread in all of these books is settler colonialism and colonial violence and how that affects Indigenous people's lives. It's changed how we exist in this world. It's changed how we're seen in society. You know, existing as an Indigenous person in a world that was built to serve settlers is very difficult, and sometimes books like these can be a nice getaway from that, or a nice place to feel accepted. And anyway, so I don't ramble too much, I'll jump right into it. The first book I'm going to be discussing is a work of fiction by Nez Perce author Beth Piatote, and it is The Bead Workers. Beth Piatote is also an associate professor of Native Studies at the University of California. So first of all, the cover is absolutely gorgeous. I remember when I first was sent this by Counterpoint Press, this was gifted, I was just blown away by the cover. And this was one of my favorite releases from 2019. I think it's one of my all-time favorite books now. So it's a short story collection, but there is also poems, and there's also actually a play. I've said this in my review on Instagram, which I will try to link down below. Otherwise, I'll link my blog post to the review. This collection is full of such good medicine. I felt whole while I was reading it, and I know that sounds kind of corny, but like, I remember reading this and just feeling like this is what I needed. I could not believe how much I loved this book. I thought every single story, play, poem was well written. The characters always felt really fully fleshed out, and I feel like sometimes that's hard to do when you're writing a book of short stories. So for myself, this collection really spoke about Indigenous resilience, whether that's in Indigenous identities, in our communities, in our different tribal art and customs. And one of the traditions that's obviously very important to the story is beadworking, which, each tribe usually has its own styles, but for me, a common thread is that beadworking links generations together, and it brings families together, and it's kind of something you can teach your kids and pass down to your relatives. It's just a really strong form of kinship, in my opinion. You know, we discuss where Indigenous strength comes from, what that can look like, how we hold our traditions close, how we keep things alive when colonial society is really trying to either kill our customs or steal them by putting them in museums or something. So yeah, 5 out of 5. All of these are 5 out of 5s, but this is beautiful. So the next book I'm going to share is also a short story collection. This one is called Annie Muktuk and Other Stories by Inuk author Norma Dunning. This was published in 2017 by University of Alberta Press. I didn't read this, I think, until 2018, and when I tell you, like, I know, okay, all of these books are my favorite, but I am being 100% honest. Usually kind of a short story collection, sometimes it can take a little while to get into the flow of things. This had me hooked by the first story. And the first story is only like 4 pages long. It is so powerful, so hard-hitting. I just couldn't believe it, and I actually recommend this all the time on Instagram. It still doesn't get as much traction as I think it deserves, but I have been seeing more and more reviews, and a friend of mine who's actually reading it right now messaged me and was like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe how engrossing this collection is. And she said that, like, literally within the first couple stories, she was just completely blown away. And I agree, that's exactly how I felt. It's just such a powerful collection. And Norma Dunning really created like a safe space for Inuit women to kind of embrace their sexuality and take hold of their identity. Because in this novel, you can really see how colonial society is trying to take away the identity, the power, the customs of Inuit communities. And in this collection, there is a short story about 3 Inuit girls who are taken to residential school, and when I tell you that that story still sticks with me, I say that from the bottom of my heart. This is full of Muktuk language, just full of symbolism, full of power. I cannot recommend this novel enough. I think that Dunning's writing style is very decolonized, so I think that if you go into this expecting a very kind of Western take on the Inuit perspective, you're going to be missing out on a lot of the reading experience. Just let the stories speak for themselves, I guess is all I'm trying to say. So the next book I have is A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Tuscarora writer Alicia Elliott. This is nonfiction. It's a collection of essays. And I would say when people come to me saying that they want to learn more about Indigenous issues, this is probably the #1 collection that I turn them towards. So in this, Elliott talks about the treatment of Indigenous people in North America as a whole, and then also writes her own personal experiences growing up as an Indigenous woman in Canada. And I think she confronts a lot of stereotypes that people have about Canada and how PC we are and how well everyone's treated. And then you come to read her essays when she's talking about the case of Colton Bushy, who was shot in the head by a white farmer in Saskatchewan. Colton Bushy was a Cree man, and Gerard Stanley, the farmer who shot him, was found not guilty. And all of this happened so soon after Tina Fontaine, who was a 15-year-old girl in Winnipeg who was Indigenous. Her alleged killer was found not guilty, very close in time to Colton Bushy's killer being set free. And so those experiences are just part of Indigenous reality in Canada, and everybody kind of thinks, oh, everyone has it so easy, but you know, no one ever really talks about the third world living conditions of most reservations up north, how almost none of our reservations have safe drinking water, and how food security isn't really a thing for a lot of Indigenous communities, being raised in poverty, mental health issues not being addressed in Native families. Elliott touches on a lot of things, ranging from those to even ranging to Margaret Atwood's anti-Indigenous behavior, and how Canada is often more willing to accept someone like Joseph Boyden, who doesn't really have a claim to call himself Indigenous and be published as an Indigenous author, how Canada is more willing to accept people like that than they are actual Indigenous writers. Alicia Elliott really says it all in this collection, and I recommend this to everybody. If you can buy it today, I would try and do that. You will learn so much. Her voice is truly one of a kind, and I remember reading this and just thinking, oh my gosh, perfection. Next up is Indian Horse by Ojibwe author Richard Wagamese. This novel, it's a work of fiction, but a lot of it I feel was taken from Richard Wagamese's life experiences and the experiences of people he loved. And what breaks my heart about this novel is that it speaks to so many Indigenous people's stories who were sent to residential schools as children and came back incredibly traumatized as young adults or people in their later teenage years, and how their entire lives were never the same because of the horrific sexual, physical, and mental abuse they endured at the residential schools across Canada. I think books like this are important because it's crazy to me how many times I still hear, I had no idea residential schools were a thing. And for someone whose grandparents went to residential schools, whose parents went to day schools, and seeing and knowing what a huge impact that has, not only on the people who went, but on their family and the intergenerational trauma that lingers. Books like this are incredibly important for spreading awareness and getting people to kind of finally learn about what so many Indigenous people across Canada went through. And so yeah, this is a work of fiction about Saul Indian Horse, who gets sent to a residential school and really finds solace in playing hockey. So this novel also has quite a lot of like hockey scenes. And I'm not a huge fan of sports writing, but I find the hockey scenes are incredibly readable. They're exciting, has you wondering what's gonna happen next. So we follow Saul through residential school and afterwards, and him dealing with the fallout of being so traumatized. Richard Wagamese unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He's one of my all-time favorite writers. I would start off by reading this, and then really anything else by him is great. Medicine Walk is probably my next favorite. But if you're wanting to learn more about residential schools, I would read this. But if you are Indigenous and maybe you went to a residential or a day school or your family did, I would proceed with caution because sometimes stories like this can be a little bit triggering. But at the end of the day, I really do think this is another novel that's full of good medicine. Last but certainly not least, because it's one of my all-time favorite story collections, is Islands of Decolonial Love by Ojibwe author Leanne Batasmasek Simpson. So this is a collection of short stories and songs. The songs read like poems, but you can actually listen to the songs online. And there's a really great audiobook narrated by Tantu Cardinal that you can find on Spotify. I highly recommend the audiobook. I listened to the audiobook as I read this. I'm currently hosting a read-along on Instagram for Islands of Decolonial Love, which we have been reading in July, and next month I'm going to be reading, actually I have it right here, This Accent of Being Lost by Leanne Batasmasek Simpson. So if you can find this, you should be able to join us for August if you wish. So I've read this probably, I'd say, 8 times. I turn back to it often. I am an Anishinaabe, which is Ojibwe. As I said, so is Leanne Simpson. This collection for me has always been such a safe space. I truly feel acknowledged. I feel cared for. I feel represented when I read this collection. And if you're Ojibwe or if you're an Indigenous woman, you'll know that's not an easy thing to find sometimes. So when I'm having a really bad day, I often turn to this and I open any page and I can just feel welcomed. Again, Leanne really wrote this collection in a very decolonized way. So if you're kind of have a Western mindset and you go into this, sometimes you might be like, what's going on? But if you go in this with an open mind and if you go in it kind of using an Anishinaabe mindset or a worldview or a lens, you're gonna be blown away. I think we need more decolonized literature. I think it's important. I think it's crucial to kind of knocking down the walls of colonialism. And I think collections like this really strengthen Indigenous people. It can allow non-Indigenous people to become better allies to us by reading our stories and our songs. It's just like nothing I've ever read, and I don't think that I'm ever going to love a book as much as I love this one. It's very special to me. And I recommend it all the time, which is why I'm hosting the read along, because I kind of wanted to garner more attention towards her writing, because I don't see it enough on Instagram at all. And she actually has a new book coming out, I believe on the 22nd of July. So keep your eye out for that. So yeah, those are 5 of my favorite Indigenous authored books and 5 that I find myself recommending constantly. Well, I would hope that you would read them all. Even if you just pick up 1 or 2, I guarantee that your reading experience is going to be so rich and so full. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed my recommendations. I hope you're well, and miigwech.